Hello everyone and welcome back to the FAI Wire. This is the third episode of our video series. Again, thank you for joining us as we talk about geopolitics in the Middle East and how it coincides with the Great Commission reaching the unreached in that region as we move towards the end of the age. Before I begin with today's updates, I just want to remind everyone that the FAI Wire is on Twitter. You can find us on Twitter. Our handle is @FAI_wire, or just search on Twitter for the FAI Wire. Find us and follow us. We obviously only make these video updates once every other week, but we're active on Twitter almost every day, sharing news stories and posts from correspondents and other partners in the region who we are familiar with and who we trust to give you good information and keep you up to date. So follow us there. Today we have three big updates to share with you. All of them, ironically, breaking yesterday as of the recording of this video, which was Thursday, March 23rd. The first is making headlines right now across the world relating to a drone attack that targeted U.S. troops in northeast Syria. This drone attack killed a U.S. military contractor, wounded another 5 U.S. military service members, and a second contractor was also wounded. 2 were seriously wounded, had to be evacuated out of the area to facilities inside Iraq. This is the 78th attack against U.S. service members in Iraq and Syria since U.S. President Joe Biden took office in January of 2021. Lately, these attacks have had a pace of one about every 10 days or so. The vast majority of attacks, some of them are committed by ISIS and the remnants of ISIS, but most of these attacks have been conducted by radical Shia militias that are aligned with and funded and supported and trained and armed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, which is the militant arm of the Iranian government, mostly using Iran-made drones and rockets. Most of the attacks are indirect, and there's no casualties, very little material damage, but occasionally you have a tragic incident like the one yesterday where a U.S. citizen was killed and others were injured. U.S. military responded to the attack. CENTCOM, which is the military command in the Middle East, released a statement today saying that there was an airstrike in response to the drone attack that targeted an IRGC base in eastern Syria. No word on the damage or casualties caused by that airstrike, but it struck a base in eastern Syria, kind of near the border with Iraq, which is along the land bridge that Iran has built between Tehran, the capital of Iran, that runs all the way through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon and down to the border of Israel. And it's along this land bridge that Iran ferries weapons and material, money, and fighters from far away as Afghanistan and Pakistan to be a threat to Israel and its Arab allies in the region. Israel routinely strikes targets along this land bridge. In fact, it struck another target at the Aleppo airport in Syria just last night. So that's a routine thing, but less common for the United States to carry out airstrikes against Iranian targets unless it's in response to Iranian aggression, as it was in this case. So the airstrikes against the RGC comes during the same week that many historians and journalists have been reminiscing about the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which began in March of 2003. And obviously there's an ongoing debate in the Western world and across the world about whether that war was morally and strategically justifiable. It's definitely been a mixed bag. Both good and bad things have come out of it. On one hand, Saddam Hussein's regime was one of the most aggressive and bloody regimes of the 20th century, had at least at one time before the war a very active chemical and biological weapons program, although as evidence later played out showed that it did not have so much of one after the invasion began in 2003. On the other hand, Saddam's regime provided, although it was brutal, it provided a sense of stability in a very diverse country. Iraq is majority Shia Islam, but also has Sunni Muslims, Sunni Arab Muslims, and obviously Kurds and Turkmen and Syrians and other ethnic and religious groups in the north, Yazidis as well. And so as brutal and repressive as Saddam's regime was, and as evil as it was, it provided a sense of stability in the region and in the country itself for several decades. The removal of Saddam's regime not only led to a lot of instability and upheaval in Iraq, but also empowered Iraq's neighbor, Iran. As many of you know, Iran and Iraq fought a bitter war to a stalemate through the better part of the 1980s. After the Islamic Revolution inside Iran and the Shia Muslim regime came to power in Iran, Saddam Hussein, with backing from the United States government, launched a war of aggression against Iran in the early 1980s. That war ended in 1988. In the closing days of the war, Saddam committed acts of genocide against the Kurdish people in the north. The famous Halabja massacre was an incident where the Iraqi army gassed a community of Kurds in Halabja, which was aligned with the Iranian government during the war, killed between 3,000 and 5,000 Kurdish civilians. A famous iconic image from that massacre came out of that massacre of a Kurdish mother dead in the street of Halabja, cradling her dead infant. Both had died of mustard and nerve gas inhalation. So sort of a bittersweet, the end of the Saddam Hussein regime was sort of a bittersweet thing. But in many ways, Iraq and the region traded the devil that it knew for devils that it didn't know. And two of those devils were the twin-headed dragons of the Iranian regime and the IRGC, and also ISIS, which arose out of this weird sort of synthesis of the remnants of Saddam's regime and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which arose after the invasion. And they, of course, swept across the Sunni and Kurdish areas of Syria and Iraq in 2014 and created an existential crisis for the Kurdish people between 2014 and 2017. So looking back now, 20 years at the Iraq War has been a mixed bag. Obviously, for the Kurdish people, after the end of the war, they established an autonomous region in the north where they can at least govern themselves with their own internal affairs, with their own government, the Kurdistan Regional Government. But that has led to its own challenges, especially in its relationship with the central government in Baghdad. The Kurdish people in northern Iraq, or the Kurdish government, I should say, in northern Iraq, isn't legally, according to Iraqi law, supposed to sell oil and natural gas to foreign customers, foreign governments, although it does right now to Turkey. All those sales are supposed to go through Baghdad, but there has been incessant corruption over the last couple of decades in Baghdad, which is ironically something that Saddam Hussein was very intolerant of, that is corruption. But since the end of his regime, corruption has just proliferated across Iraq, and this sort of quasi-democratic government and all the billions of dollars that have been poured into Iraq for reconstruction and from foreign companies drilling for oil and natural gas. There's been a lot of people across Iraq who have gotten rich, and there's been a sort of ballooning issue of corruption there, and that has created issues for the Kurdistan Regional Government, which needs its share of oil and natural gas sales to fund its government and to fund civil servants in the Kurdistan region. So even in Kurdistan to this day, if you talk to a lot of Kurds who remember Saddam's regime, there's this sort of nostalgia for the stability and government, you could call it even government, a sense of government integrity of that time, while there's certainly no love lost for Saddam and his family, which again committed brutal, horrific acts of genocide and war crimes against the Kurdish people. This leads us to our second big piece of news from Thursday. U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley testified before U.S. Congress that Iran could have enough nuclear material to build a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks. And that Iran, if it wanted to, could construct a nuclear bomb within, quote, several months. This is often referred to as Iran's breakout period, which is much shorter now compared to what it was predicted to be back in 2015 when the Iranian nuclear deal went into effect. Almost 8 years ago, at that time, it was considered 1 to 2 years before Iran could develop enough material to build a nuke. Now it's considered just weeks and several months before Iran could have a nuclear weapon that it could, quote unquote, field or use potentially against the state of Israel. So this again brings up the nuclear question. How is the world going to handle Iran's nuclear program? And as we can see, that whole issue is really coming to a head at this point. We see Iran making moves in the region to try to isolate the state of Israel, its arch nemesis, especially reaching out diplomatically to Saudi Arabia and in Egypt in recent months, partly because its economy is in tatters and it needs to build economic ties, but also because it wants to isolate Israel, even as the Israeli government is working to establish a normalized diplomacy with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who was once again Prime Minister of Israel, was out of office for a short period of time earlier this year and last year, but who was the Prime Minister of Israel for more than a decade before that, has consistently said over the course of the last decade that his government will refuse to allow the Iranian regime to develop a nuclear weapon, and has been the foremost world leader in exposing the Iranian nuclear program. And so we can see this issue really beginning to come to a head, and this has become probably the biggest issue not only for Israelis and the biggest prayer point for those of us who are praying for the peace of Jerusalem and for the Israeli people, but also in the region and the world, as a war between Israel and Iran would have massive ripple effects throughout the world, not unlike the war in Ukraine, and probably bigger. So that's the latest on Iran. The third big news on Thursday, which wasn't necessarily big news, everybody knew it was coming, but it was officially announced, was the beginning of the Islamic season of Ramadan. Ramadan, as many of you know, is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. It's a month in which Muslims around the world fast and practice other forms of religious observance for 29 or 30 days, depending on the length of the month. The Islamic calendar is a strictly lunar calendar, depending on the cycle of the moon. So once the new moon is spotted in the sky officially is when Ramadan begins. That happened yesterday as of this recording, which was Thursday. As many of you also know, Ramadan is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It was commanded by Muhammad in the Quran to be observed as not only a time of fasting, when Muslims fast from sunup to sundown throughout the month, but Muslims are also taught to perform various other forms of restraint, such as abstaining from tobacco, abstaining from sexual relations within marriage, and abstaining from other forms of sinful behavior. Ramadan is also, unfortunately, a time of increased tension between Israelis and Palestinians, especially in Jerusalem, as thousands of Palestinians, many of them militant Palestinians, flood into East Jerusalem and the Old City to observe Ramadan. especially the plaza around the Damascus Gate, which is the large gate facing East Jerusalem. There tends to be a lot of tension as Muslims congregate there, tension between Muslims and Israeli police or the Israeli border guard, but also between Palestinians and far-right Israelis, as we saw last year, riots and brawls between those two groups that the Israeli police had to break up. So this is kind of a yearly cycle, and we already see the Israeli border guard, which is kind of the police force of East Jerusalem and the Old City, beefing up across the area, especially on Fridays, when thousands of Palestinians stream into the Old City to go up on the Temple Mount and pray in the Temple Mount Plaza behind the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this sort of beefing up of security is highlighted by the fact that today, Friday the 24th, the flag of the Hamas terrorist organization was hoisted up on the Temple Mount, once again demonstrating the increasing influence that Hamas has and other militant jihadist groups have in East Jerusalem and on the Temple Mount itself in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So once again, we see that this whole Ramadan season is really playing out against the backdrop of increased tensions between militant groups in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Israeli military, as there's been an increase in terrorist attacks coming from the West Bank along border areas or in Jerusalem. The IDF responds with operations, as we've talked about, inside Nablus or Jenin or in other areas in the West Bank, which have in turn then, of course, been used as pretexts for more terrorist attacks. So as the cycle continues to increase in the Holy Land, what we're seeing now is a year that's on track to be the deadliest year for both Israelis and Palestinians since 2007, when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. At least 15 Israelis have died in terrorist attacks this year, all civilians, and at least 85 Palestinians have died, mostly militants, in Israeli military and police actions. So obviously, as always, this is a time to continue in prayer and intercession for the people of Israel and for the people of the Palestinian territories. Not only that, but for the wider Muslim world during the season of Ramadan. We will continue to, as Muslims continue to pray and observe religious traditions during the Ramadan season. It is also a time for Christians to be reminded of the unreached in the Muslim world and to continue in prayer and intercession for them. So once again, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Wire. We'll continue to give you updates on Twitter, and we look forward to our next video update in a couple of weeks. Love you all. Have a great couple of weeks. Maranatha.